Okay, let's dive right into today's explainer, where we'll be breaking down Kai Yao's fascinating 2026 paper. This paper asks a truly critical question for our time. What exactly does a university degree or credential actually certify when artificial intelligence is the one doing part of the work? We are finally moving past that initial, simple panic of students just using generative AI to cheat. Now we really need to look at the much deeper structural issue of how we measure human learning in a world where machines can whip up completely flawless academic artifacts on demand. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. The broken educational premise. 2. Understanding educational delegation. 3. Introducing cognitive stewardship. 4. Grading the university policies. And finally, 5. Designing better AI assessments. All right, part 1. The broken educational premise. Let's look at why the old model of assessment is suddenly so fragile. For decades now, education has relied on this quiet, foundational premise that is literally crumbling right before our eyes. Think about this for a second. If an AI system becomes highly accurate, incredibly safe, and practically free, why should humans still learn? Now, historically, a lot of people defended traditional education by pointing out AI's weaknesses, things like hallucinations, built-in bias, or just poor reasoning. But as the source material points out, that is a very unstable foundation to build our future on. If a brilliantly polished essay, a perfectly clean line of code, or an entire lesson plan can be generated instantly, how on earth do we prove the human actually learned anything at all? Under the old educational premise, it was pretty simple. A flawless final product meant that the student actually possessed the cognitive skills required to make it. But under our new reality, that exact same artifact might equal human competence, sure, or it might just reflect some really intensive machine assistance. A flawless final product just doesn't guarantee that the student actually performed the cognitive operations we're trying to assess anymore. That core link between the artifact and the learner, it's broken. Moving on to part 2, understanding educational delegation. What exact tasks are we handing over to AI? To fix this broken link, we really need to completely change our vocabulary. We have to stop asking if AI was used, right? And instead, we need to start asking which specific mental tasks were handed off to the machine. Yao calls this concept educational delegation. The crucial point here is whether the student delegated something minor, like spell checking or maybe translating text for accessibility, or if they delegated something foundational to the actual learning process, like evidence selection, argument structure, or diagnostic reasoning. Educational delegation forces us to map exactly which cognitive operations moved from the learner to the system, and which ones actually stayed with the human. Which brings us to a really comforting analogy. Offloading cognitive work isn't new, and it honestly isn't inherently the enemy. Think of it just like how we allow calculators in an advanced math class. We allow the tool, but we still require evidence of mathematical understanding, maybe through showing your work or having to explain a theorem. We must design AI policies that verify the human mind is still fully engaged. It's unverified offloading that is the real threat to educational validity. Which brings us to part 3, introducing cognitive stewardship. This is a brand new framework to govern AI-mediated learning. So how do we actually build this into a practical framework that institutions can use today, rather than just panicking over AI cheating or throwing their hands up in defeat? Well, the proposed solution is called cognitive stewardship. This is the institutional practice of governing the division of labor between humans and AI. Basically, it means institutions need to proactively manage that handoff between the student and the machine to ensure that understanding, verification, and responsibility are all preserved. That's how you ensure the final credential remains entirely valid. Now, this framework relies on a really solid 4-part architecture. First up, you define the learning claim. What exactly are you certifying that this student can do? Second is the delegation boundary. What is AI specifically allowed to do in this context? Third, you need an evidence standard. What observable work must the human still demonstrate to prove they actually met that claim? And fourth, safeguards. How do you protect the student's privacy, equity, and due process along the way? If literally any of these 4 pieces are missing, your policy is incomplete. Okay, part 4, grading the university policies. Let's look at an actual empirical audit of current AI guidance. To see how reality actually stacks up against this theory, the source material conducted an empirical audit of official public generative AI assessment policies. And get this, they uniquely used 4 open-weight large language models to code and score these policies based on a strict rubric, averaging the scores out to reduce any single model's bias. They analyzed official guidance from 30 universities across the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US just to see if they are successfully implementing those 4 parts of cognitive stewardship we just talked about. Looking at the data from the study, you'll see a pretty massive gap. Universities are actually super quick to draw boundaries around what is allowed or prohibited, but they severely fail to establish the evidence standards required to actually prove learning happened. Basically, they are giving permission, but they are not asking for proof. To put a hard number on it, a whopping 93% of the audited policies strictly prohibit simple final output substitution, which, yeah, makes total sense, right? Because having an AI write your entire final essay looks exactly like traditional academic misconduct. It's a very easy boundary to draw. But wow, look at how things change when the tasks get just a bit more complex. When we move away from total substitution to more nuanced, realistic tasks, things like feedback support, process support, or verifying AI outputs, institutional guidance becomes incredibly thin. Students are basically told these things might be conditionally allowed, but actionable evidence is almost never demanded to prove the student maintained cognitive control. And then there's that 4th pillar of our framework, safeguards. Honestly, it's a complete mess across these institutions. While 67% of universities do warn students about privacy and data usage, they almost entirely ignore other vital student protections. Things like the right to appeal false accusations, equity of access to paid AI tools, and workload limits are severely lacking. In fact, workload proportionality was mentioned in a mere 4% of policies. Institutions are clearly focusing on surveillance and compliance rather than equitable assessment. Finally, Part 5. Designing better AI assessments. Let's talk about moving from permission to proof. So, how can educators and administrators actually fix this broken system and implement true cognitive stewardship? We absolutely must shift our institutional mindset. We have to move away from a misconduct-centered policy that obsesses over banning tools, detecting AI, and catching cheaters. Instead, we need a delegation governance mindset. This means focusing on designing verifiable human tasks. It focuses on how we capture the trace of human reasoning, the process of revision, and the professional judgment that remains after AI is used as a tool. Let's make this concrete. For an essay, instead of relying on those wildly flawed AI detectors, a cognitive stewardship approach requires an annotated source map and maybe live discussions on how the student accepted or rejected the AI's feedback. Or for programming, instead of a blanket ban on coding AI, you allow it for boilerplate code, but you require a live walkthrough where the student must debug and defend their design choices on the spot. Cognitive stewardship doesn't mean just burying students in more paperwork. It means creating a much better match between the learning claim being tested and the permitted AI help. It all boils down to this one brilliant quote from the text. Institutions certify people, not just products. A degree or a credential must represent a human being's capacity to interpret data, contest errors, and take ultimate responsibility for their work, completely regardless of the technological tools they use to build it. Which leaves me with this final, somewhat provocative thought for you to chew on today. If an AI can perfectly execute your job's final outputs tomorrow, what invisible cognitive skills, what underlying human judgments does your educational credential prove you actually still possess? Understanding that difference is absolutely the future of education. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.